Lost River Baptist Church in Claysville, Indiana. I will spare you the trouble of looking up this place and trying to locate it. Even if you're on the most detailed of maps, it's likely not there, and that's because the last post office dissolved many decades ago, as did any commercial enterprise, so that 40 years ago, all that was left were two houses, one of them occupied, a crossroads, and a church. Lost River was a small congregation, made smaller by the fact that it endured a split in 1837. After that split, colloquially, our church was known as Lost River Missionary Baptist Church, and the other congregation, because it was a bunch of Carmelites, became known as the Lost River Primitive Baptist Church. They were the anti-missions folks. To give you an idea, on a good Sunday, we had 25 there. On a really good Sunday, 30. Nonetheless, the congregation was composed of 10 nuclear family units, though virtually everybody in the congregation was either a Rutherford or a Holsapple, or was related to the Holsapples or Rutherfords. Here's how Dawn and I got to know these folks. There was a sign-up sheet on the back bulletin board in the sanctuary. Every Sunday of the world, she and I went to one of the homes for lunch. They had signed up there. They signed on for the responsibility, and we signed up for the time. So among these folks were Bill and Edith, who bred dogs in their basement and let them ticky-tacky on the floor beside us on the linoleum while we ate. There were Allie and Claude, whose death provided my first occasion for a funeral. Philip and Judy, whose pipes froze every winter, giving us a chance to drink Pepsi straight out of a bottle with our lunch. Bob and Mary Frances, who had the responsibility for making the Lord's Supper bread, because that responsibility was passed from the beginning of the church in the first decade of the 19th century to the present, from family to family. Then there were John and Ruth. John, a building contractor who had gold fixtures in his main bathroom, and Jenny. Jenny, the matriarch of the lot, who told us stories about her nephew, actor Richard Chamberlain. Now that doesn't complete the list, but every Sunday, somewhere, we had a meal prepared. We sat down at a table prepared. I'm looking to the floor in front of me and you. Another table, the Lord's table, prepared for us, and what does it mean? What happens when we uncover this table and find the elements sitting there in their respective trays? Is it a moment of magic? Would we describe it like that? Is it a moment of wonder? Does coming to the table call for a new or renewed relationship with God? Or is it maybe all of those things and more? At a time of distress and stress, the psalmist was thinking about another table. Only this was a table in the wilderness. But curiously, as we study this Psalm 78 and think about that table, verse 19, I think we find some lessons very appropriate for us today. The psalmist's question was this: can God spread a table in the wilderness? I don't know what kind of image comes to mind for you. Not likely that we would express any of our picnic outings with the words, let's have a table in the wilderness. But here's the deal. If you and I take a full-blown meal to somewhere out of the norm, out into the woods, it will involve some work, because it's one thing to say, let's have a picnic, and it's another thing actually to have the picnic. Imagine, if you will, pulling up to a rest stop somewhere along the interstate. You find there 6 concrete picnic tables, 3 of them nestled beneath the trees. A family of 4 from New Jersey, well, you know they're from New Jersey because the license plate said so, have sat down at the table. But what a lunch it is. The mom, well, it had to be the mom, even though you didn't see her do it, has spread a white tablecloth on that table. And on that table, she has set white chinette plates, not the flimsy ones that are $100 for $1.49, the really heavy, nice paper plates, along with the really nice tableware and the glasses. They weren't bottom of the line either. And incredibly, in the midst of all of this table and everything else she has placed there, was sitting a massive platter of fried chicken. You cannot see all of the dishes. It's probably becoming obvious to them by now that you are a little too interested in what's happening at that table. You do know, however, that a full-blown meal is happening. They've gone to a lot of trouble. This was not a meal that was slapped together. The picnic table likely did not know what was happening to it. It had never had a tablecloth before. It is safe to say, though, that this was a table spread in the wilderness. The psalmist wants to know if God goes to that kind of trouble. God provided for his children as they marched through the wilderness. He gave them a lifetime worth of manna and quail. Through extenuating circumstances, he provided enough water for a city of people. But you know how it is. You know how we treat people. We ask questions like, what have you done for me lately? And unfortunately, we even treat God that way sometimes. Lord, I know you saved me, but really, what have you done for me lately? And that's the tenor of the question here in Psalm 78. In other words, Lord, what are you really capable of? I find it interesting to listen to the words people use to describe God. They will use terms like all-powerful, present everywhere, knows everything, sovereign, holy, absolute truth, righteous, just, merciful love, faithful, the one who never changes. Those who have been schooled in Greek philosophy will use words like omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent. The word omni, of course, meaning all. Potent is powerful, all-powerful. Sentient meaning knowing, all-knowing, present. Well, omnipresent everywhere. But those are pretty philosophical terms, not at all really down to earth for most of us. When someone asks you about God, when someone asks you what God is capable of, do you talk like that, or what do you say? One thinker said, our amazing God is capable of doing anything as long as it does not violate one of his attributes. No task is too big for him, he never fails, and he is never tired, frustrated, or discouraged. I read that and wondered about the not frustrated or discouraged part. I think humanity might very well frustrate and discourage God sometimes, but I get the rest of that. Nothing is beyond God's capacity or comprehension. And yet I'm not sure that even these descriptions really get down to earth with us. The psalmist says, can God spread a table in the wilderness? And I wonder. It's what he did for the Israelites. Maybe it's what he wants to do for us too. In fact, when we come to a service like this, maybe that's exactly what he's doing. He's come to meet us here. He's come to prepare us. He's come to feed us. Do you think? Here's the other thing. When the psalmist raised this question in Psalm 78, he did so in a season of doubt. The waters are rising. Does God still care for us? We're down to our last loaf of bread. Will God provide? We don't know how we're going to live. Is God going to make a way for us? The enemy is peeking around the corner. What's God going to do about that? And the history of God's activity with his people says he does care. He will be there. God does provide a table in the wilderness. He's done it before, and he'll do it again. We can trust this God. He is no mere theoretical God. He actually comes to us with the power of love. There's another passage of Scripture that helps us understand all this. It's so simple and profound that you might wonder why we haven't thought of it this way before. The thought is embedded in Psalm 23. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Have you thought about that? As a way of looking at the start of a new year and a way of thinking about the Lord's table and the Lord's Supper, I would ask you to consider three notions this morning. The first of them, God is willing to meet us at our most desperate moments. Have you thought about what Psalm 23 means? Preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies? I don't know about you, but if I have enemies imminent, I'm probably not hungry. And besides that, I tend to reserve special eating experiences for people I like to be around. People who despise each other generally don't issue dinner invitations to one another. For one thing, you might be concerned about what the guy across the table from you would do with that dinner knife. And yet, we can have such confidence in the Lord that it's okay to sit down with our enemies. That will be a table the Lord has prepared. He is the one who issues the invitations. He will oversee the entire operation. We will not be eating a dinner that's somewhere outside of his presence. God demonstrates his power in caring for us when the circumstances may at best be trifling. God is willing to meet us in our most desperate moments. Can God spread a table in the wilderness? Well, sure. God lives in the wilderness. God owns the wilderness. Nothing will surprise God. No one will surprise God. So you can have confidence when you break bread with the enemy. We may think that the moment is about filling our bellies. The truth is, the moment is about God showing us who he really is. God is willing to meet us in our most desperate moments. God is also, secondly, feeding us when we are most vulnerable. If we have stockpiled food and chalked it up to our own ingenuity, then God doesn't factor in that picture. But if we look at our plates and recognize that we didn't have anything to do with getting it there, save for the grace of God, we would not have this meal, then we know God is feeding us. When we take ourselves out of the equation and realize that we are totally dependent on God, the picture changes. When we say, I did nothing to earn this, we begin to understand God feeds us when we are most vulnerable, desperate, and vulnerable. Moments described with those words make us wish for a simple loaf of bread. Just get us through the situation, Lord. We won't ask for anything else. But not only does God meet us in our desperation, not only does he come to us when we are vulnerable, he sets a table for us in the wilderness, which means, thirdly, he shows us grace. Think about that rest stop picnic table again, the white tablecloth and the platter of chicken. Realize that God has gone to a great deal of trouble for us, and the title for what he has done is grace. You see, it turns out that God is not very efficient. Periodically, I receive these printouts from Cameron. The good thing about that envelope is it's not a bill, but the bad thing is it brings on the guilt. This thing is printed in black and green and orange, and the single sheets state numbers and say, in effect, let's talk about your electric and gas usage. You do well, but your neighbors do better. Come on, now let's amp it up a little. And I think I'll amp you up a little as I confront this term efficiency. God turns out not to be very efficient. I mean, for goodness sake, he spoke the world into being. Could he not have saved us in a less brutal, bloody, and painful way than sending his own son to die for us? If he spoke the world into being, might he not have been able to speak our salvation into being? That would have been so much more efficient. I'm sure the folks at Amron would have appreciated that. God, however, is about grace. And grace is not only unmerited love, it is a blanket of love that keeps on giving. God is extravagant with his love. He could think of no better way, no more terrific way to demonstrate his love than by sending to us family, his own son. Maybe the world will get it if I send my own son, he thought. God has given us love and grace and new mercies, and they have overflowed. We think about the Merrimack River bottoms that have overflowed. What about the overflow of God's love for us through Jesus? That is the gift that keeps on giving. How do we know about this love? We know about this love because God spreads for us a table in the wilderness. And to show how extravagant he is, he even invites our enemy to sit down with us. We observe the Lord's Supper on Christmas Eve. It hasn't been our tradition, but we did it this time around. After all, the story that began with the Bethlehem manger did not end with the Bethlehem manger. It included the cross and resurrection. And how do we remember the cross and resurrection? One of the chiefest ways is by observing the Lord's Supper. So we told the whole story, birth to death to resurrection, by way of the Lord's Supper. And 10 days later, we are back here again to observe the Lord's Supper again. So quickly, yes, because God commands it and we need it. He meets us in our desperate moments. He meets us in our vulnerability. God shows us grace, grace upon grace at moments like this. And so, as we remember, as we celebrate, as we take bold new steps into a new year, remember what Jesus did for you. Remember that he called you to his table, and then hold this truth close to your heart. God's extravagant love is spread for you.